Hello. Well, today we're going to start our Causes of the Civil War unit by talking about one of the three major aspects that we're going to focus on, and that is the economic factors. Now, we've been kind of leading up to this unit over the last several months talking about various aspects of how the nation is growing, how they're expanding, how there's different things that are putting pressures on both the North and the South. And in this unit, we're going to focus on some of the factors that eventually lead to the start of the Civil War. It's not as easy as just saying there's one particular cause of the Civil War. It's actually a combination of a bunch of different things that are happening in the country. Today we're going to focus on the economic. Now, as we go through the next couple of weeks, we're going to focus on three different types of causes. We're going to talk about economic today. We're also going to talk about the political factors and then the social factors as well. So to give you kind of a lead up to what you're going to be doing on the assessment at the end of the unit, we're going to ask you to summarize three of the different particular aspects of each of these types of causes. So, for example, from the information that you're going to write down today in the notes, we're going to ask you to explain three of the economic factors that are eventually going to lead to the start of the war. Later, you'll find out about the political ones, and then, of course, the social ones as well. So let's start by talking about some of the economic differences between the North and the South. And as we get started, I also want to kind of remind you of the date that we're kind of using as a milepost in this particular unit. The official start of the war is going to happen on April 12th of 1861. So as we talk about dates both in this section of notes and in sections later on, I just want you to kind of keep that particular date in mind because that's the date at which it officially becomes the Civil War. Now, we've talked a lot, especially a couple units ago, about some of the differences between the North and the South as far as their economies. We've talked about the difference in manufacturing, the reliance of the South on agriculture, and how these two different regions have very different priorities as far as their economies. So the first thing I want to do today is I want to show you a couple graphs. And these are some graphs that I was able to locate on the internet, I believe 2 years ago. And I think sometimes when we have all these dates and, well, not particularly dates, but all these different totals and statistics and stuff, it's kind of hard to visualize what that means. And so this is going to be a series of slides where you don't have to jot anything down in your notes, but I just want you to kind of look at the differences between the North and the South in a couple of different categories. So the first one I want to look at shows population. So as we look at this top graph, all of these graphs are going to use common coding. When you see blue, that represents the North or the Union. When you see the gray color, that represents the Confederate States once the war starts. And then I believe that and then the turquoise colors, that is the border states. So I want you to kind of look first at the population. At the time that the war starts, the North has about 18.5 million people. And then look at the South. The South has 5.5 million people that are whites, and then 3.5 slaves in the South. So again, look at this number and look at this graph on the difference in population there. This is going to become very important later on as we talk about the Civil War really becoming a war of attrition. And the side that can really offer the most people or the largest armies are the ones that are going to have the biggest advantage. So I wanted to point out the population first. The second part of the graph on this slide shows the difference in agriculture. And again, it's kind of surprising, I think, to a lot of people when you look at some of these first categories, corn, wheat, and oats. In all three of those categories, the North actually has a larger amount of production in those particular crops. But then look at cotton. Cotton, obviously, there's basically no production in the North. Tobacco and rice, same thing with rice, almost no production, basically no production in the North at all. So the reliance on these three crops, in particular cotton. All right, so let's move on to the second slide that shows this comparison. Livestock, you can see the differences there in horses, mules, and when you think of mules, you almost have to think of almost like an engine because that's what mules are really doing. Is they're being used for labor, they're being used for farm work. Milk cows, the Union or the North actually has a larger percentage of the milk cows. You can see beef cattle, sheep, and swine. And then look at this next one. This one's going to play a big part in some of the stuff we'll talk about later. The number of railroad miles, and this is in thousands of miles. So at the time that the Civil War starts, the North has about 20,000 miles of rail lines, and the South has about 9,000 miles of rail lines. That's going to be really important as people begin to transport goods. They transport troops to different parts of the war. So that's going to be a huge advantage for the North. All right, on the last slide that shows these comparisons, manufacturing. Look at the large advantage that the North has as far as manufacturing. This is in the number of factories in the thousands, so over 100,000 factories in the North. Number of workers, again, look at the humongous advantage the North has, and then the value of products as well. So one of the factors we're going to talk about later is the fact that the Union can resupply their army, that they can produce more goods. And you can definitely see that here in the number of workers and the number of factories. And then the last aspect is finance. This is, go back here. This is in bank deposits. You can see the big advantage the North has. And then in specie, that's basically the gold that's going to back up the currency. And the North has a big advantage in that area as well. So hopefully from those couple slides, you can kind of see a visual aspect of just how much the North has an advantage in certain areas. Population, the amount of finances they have, railroad miles, factories, and then also factory workers. Okay, we've also talked quite a bit about population in the last couple units. The northern states do have a much higher, a much larger population than the South. The North, at the time that the Civil War breaks out, has a population of about 21 million, and the South about 9 million. And again, when we look at population density, you can see that on this map here, as far as the population density in the northern states. If we look at this next slide, again, this one in a little bit more color, but this was in 1850, so this is about 10 years before the start of the war. But you can see the dense population up here in the northeast, and then how it trails off quite a bit in the south. This next map shows a good illustration of where the cities are. I circled this over here because what they did on this map was they put a white dot in what they consider to be a large city. So that's between 100,000 people and 800,000 people. And then the medium cities, a little bit smaller, 40,000 to 100,000 are in gray. So again, look at this corridor up here in the northeast. In the south, you only have a couple major cities, Charleston, South Carolina, and then New Orleans down here. And then I know it's kind of small up here, but it's kind of interesting when you look at the little last remarks here. It says, even the South's largest city, New Orleans, did not compare to the largest cities in the North. With 800,000 people, New York's population was nearly 5 times that of New Orleans. So again, even though you've got two cities here, even the cities themselves are not comparing when you look at the total population of these areas up in the northeast corridor. We've talked a lot about industry and plantation, the difference in how these two different regions are growing. Of course, the North has a much more developed industry. That's what they've been focusing their resources on, and that's going to help them a lot once we get into the war production years. And the South is relying more on cotton, rice, and tobacco. So when you look at these two things, even though they're not growing in these ways to focus on the war, once the war starts, obviously the North's going to have an advantage because they're able to produce things, the things that you're going to need for war. We always talk about in class, you know, the South has cotton production as their major economic product. Cotton is not something that's going to physically help them in the war. The South's going to try and use cotton to try and draw in England and some of the European countries to be able to kind of help them out because they believe that the European countries rely on the cotton as far as their textile industries. But you can't physically use cotton to fight a battle. It's not going to be something that you can, you know, crank out production like the North can as far as rifles and tents and all the different stuff they need for the military. Manufacturing is going to have a huge advantage in the north, significantly more manufacturing than the south. When we looked at that graph just a second ago, you can see the distinct difference in both workers and also the number of factories. So as the war goes on, and we're gonna talk more about the war in the next unit, but every month that the war goes on, it becomes more important for both sides to be able to replace the soldiers that they're losing, and then also replace the material goods that they're consuming in the war. And eventually, the South is just not going to be able to do that. It's going to become much, much harder for the South to be able to last in a prolonged war. And once we get into year 3, into year 4 of the war, this lack of production in the South is going to have a huge impact on how they're able to sustain themselves. I put this graph together to kind of show some of the differences in some particular items, and what you're seeing is the percentage of these items that are manufactured in the north. So obviously firearms are going to be very important in the war effort. 97% of the firearms produced in the United States at this time when the war breaks out is produced in northern states. Locomotives, 96%. Cloth, 94%. So again, the production of cloth is going to happen mainly in the north. Obviously, the growing of cotton is not going to happen in the north, but the production part is. So 94% of cloth is produced in northern states. Pig iron, which is basically the building block or the raw material that people are going to need to build railroad lines and anything that's made out of metal, 93% of that's produced in the north. And then shoes, 90% of shoes, for example, are produced in the north. So hopefully, again, kind of another visual where you can see a distinct advantage for the northern states. Now, the one big advantage that the South does have as far as production, of course, is cotton. The economy of the South is dominated by cotton production. We'll talk a little bit later about how they do use this as kind of a bargaining chip to try and bring in England into the war because they think that England is going to need the cotton for production. So even though you can't physically use this in war, they are going to use their economic force to kind of try and sway the European countries to come in and help the Confederacy during the Civil War. This map shows cotton production in 1860, right before the start of the Civil War. You can see the heavy cotton production here in Louisiana, right along the Mississippi River, and then also into Alabama and Mississippi here as well. Also, I want to point out on this map, we'll talk about this a little bit later, notice the outline of the state of Virginia. We commonly look at the map today and we see West Virginia separated from Virginia itself. That's going to happen later once the war starts. So in 1860, Virginia is both West Virginia and Virginia combined. This is an interesting graph that shows the number of slaves in the United States compared with the national cotton production in bales, number of bales. And so the blue line here shows the number of slaves. You can obviously see how the number of slaves is increasing, but also notice how the number of slaves increases at almost the same rate that you see the cotton production. And in fact, by the time we get to 1860, notice how cotton production jumps up dramatically in that 20-year time span. So we're seeing the advancement in the cotton gin. It's making it more profitable for people in the South to grow cotton. It's faster for them to harvest cotton. And so that demand for more slaves is going to create more and more land and production for cotton. And it's just this big cycle that's going to build upon itself. So again, kind of an interesting visualization of how both of those two things grow together between 1790 and 1860. All right, so those are some of the economic factors. We're going to talk later about the social aspects and then also the political aspects. But this is just one piece, one of the three pieces of the puzzle as we go through this particular unit. If you have any questions, go ahead and please ask me. But that's kind of a quick overview of the economic section of our notes. Thanks.